So to recap, we've looked at the crime of obtaining property by false pretenses. Defendant acquires ownership to the property because of a misrepresentation of fact. Now I want to turn to the second theft crime that's based also on fraudulent acts by the defendant. This is called the crime of larceny by trick. It's a larceny-based crime, which means that the general definition of larceny applies. What's that definition? It's the wrongful taking and carrying away of possession with the intent to permanently deprive. Here, the wrongfulness arises because the defendant tricks the victim into giving up possession. For our purposes, this is a key difference between obtaining property by false pretenses and larceny by trick. That is, whether the victim is duped into giving up ownership, buy property, or only possession, I expect the property back. What might be a time when the victim only gives up possession and not ownership? Let's try this example. Defendant heads into a Hertz rental car counter. Defendant has a fake driver's license, counterfeit credit cards. Doesn't have insurance, and his license has been suspended. He knows he'd never get Hertz to rent him the car. But on the basis of those two identifications and method of payment, Hertz rents the car to the defendant. And he takes the car with the intent to permanently deprive Hertz of it. Now from the outside, if you were standing at that counter, you would look and see what looks to be a consented to transaction. Hertz looks like it's willingly giving over the car, but that's not really true because it was based on fraud. When Hertz gave defendant the car, it only transferred possession of the car, not ownership. That should make sense to us. Hertz expects defendant to bring the car back. Since only possession transfers because of the fraud, the crime is larceny by trick. It can't be obtaining property by false pretenses because that requires ownership to transfer. But like obtaining property by false pretenses, we need to make sure that the fraud causes the victim to part with possession of the property. Fraud alone will not work. So imagine this situation. Accountant works with an elderly client. An accountant over the years has been taking money from this elderly client. Elderly client is very wealthy, never reads the books, has no idea what's going on. But to cover her tracks, accountant falsifies the records in the books. What crime has accountant committed? The answer may surprise you, but the answer is embezzlement. How could that be? Well, first of all, we know that the accountant had possession of the elderly client's account by virtue of a fiduciary responsibility. When she wrongfully converts the property, she's committed embezzlement. Well, why isn't it larceny by trick? Because you see the falsifying of the books. It's not larceny by trick just because she falsifies the books. Her acts of fraud were not intended to get possession of the property. They were only intended to cover up her embezzlement, not to induce or trick the elderly client into giving her the money. Larceny by trick generally occurs in two different situations. First, where the victim only intends to part with possession and not ownership of the property. That's like our Hertz example. There's a second situation, and that's where the victim only has possession of the property and not ownership to begin with. Any trick to relieve her of that property would only result in her giving up what she has in that property. That would be possession of the item. Let me give you an example about that. I walk into a dry cleaner's pretending to be this celebrity. I'm the assistant, and I say, I'm here to pick up the dry cleaning clothes for this fabulous celebrity. Here's my name. I'm nothing of the kind. When the dry cleaners hands over the clean clothes to me, because of the fraud, the dry cleaners only has possession of my clothes. I've committed the crime of larceny by trick. It can't be the crime of false pretenses because the dry cleaners didn't own those clothes. They were just possessing them to clean them. And so when I take it by trick, I have committed the crime of larceny by trick.